Good morning. Welcome to our online Sunday morning service. My name is Kim and I am one of the worship leaders here at the Open Door, and we are very excited to be with you this morning. Ephesians 3 verse 20 and 21 says, "Now to him who is able to do immeasurably more than all we ask or imagine, according to his power that is at work within us. To him be glory in the church and in Jesus Christ throughout all generations, forever and ever. Amen." Let's worship together this morning. Lifted up, he defeated the grave, raised to life, our God is able. In his name we overcome, for the Lord our God is able. For the Lord our God is able. God is able, he will never fail. He is Almighty God, greater than all we see, greater than all we ask. He has done great things, lifted up, he defeated the grave, raised to life, our God is able. In his name we overcome, for the Lord our God is able. God is with us, God is on our side. He will make a way, far above all we know, far above all we hope. He has done great things, lifted up, he defeated the grave, raised to life, our God is able. In his name we overcome, for the Lord our God is able. God is with us, he will go before, he will never leave us, he will never leave us. God is for us, he has opened arms, he will never fail us, he will never fail us. Lifted up, he defeated the grave, raised to life, our God is able. In his name we overcome, for the Lord our God is able. Lifted up, he defeated the grave, raised to life, our God is able. In his name we overcome, for the Lord our God is able. For the Lord our God is able. For the Lord our God is able. Please join us as we head on over to the message with Pastor Karen.
Why? 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 Why do we have to wait so long to eat? Why can't we just eat? Why do we have to sit at the kids' table? Why do we have to eat monster the whole week? Why is there so much Hebrew? Why is Herb so bitter? Why are there only 4 questions? Why not 11? Why not 13? Why am I always the youngest?
Well,
Well, good morning. I'm Karen Pearson, one of the pastors here at the Open Door. It's so good that you could join us this morning. You know, as I was preparing this message, I couldn't help but think about you homeschoolers or parents of preschoolers and how much you love that question, why, right? I mean, why is the sky blue? Why do I have a belly button? And why is God invincible? All these why questions that make our brain hurt. I remember having those questions for so many years as we had our children close in age. We had 4 boys and 5 years. And so, you know, when we first became parents, we thought it was our responsibility to provide answers for these questions. Silly me. By the time our 3rd and 4th came along, we caught on. And so when they ask us these why questions, we'd say, I don't know, go ask your smart brother. Seemed to work for us. Well, over the years, we've had our children ask these questions. We have asked these questions, you know, growing up, variations of these. But now that we're all grown up, we're not preoccupied with the color of the sky anymore, right? But there is one question that we ask from time to time, and it's why? Why me? Why is this happening to me? Why is God not answering my prayer? And believe it or not, there is an answer for this question. It's not the only answer, but definitely is an answer that we can apply to our personal and spiritual situations as far as it, you know, relates to our personal growth. And so today we want to hang out with Hannah, as Hannah asked these questions as she struggled with barrenness. And because of this barrenness, it created some conflict in her marriage. But before we get to Hannah's story, which is found in 1 Samuel chapter 1, we need to understand the condition that the world was in during that time. 1 Samuel comes on the heels of the book of Judges. And during that period of Judges, it was such a dark period. In fact, it says that everyone did what was right in their own eyes because there was no judge to give the direction to the nation. And even the priesthood was at an all-time low. And so when we first enter into 1 Samuel, you know, there's no mighty warrior that's coming loudly onto the center screen. No, we are introduced to a woman who is desperate to have a baby. And unfortunately, because she's barren, she asks this question, why? I don't usually preach from the Message Bible, but I love how this story is told there. So we're going to use this translation for the next few moments that we spend together. We'll be reading from 1 Samuel chapter 1, starting in verse 1. And it says this, there once was a man who lived in Ramathaim. He was descended from the old Zuph family in the Ephraim hills. His name was Elkanah. He was connected with Zuphus from Ephraim through his father Jeroham, his grandfather Elihu, and his great-grandfather Tohu. Gotta love those biblical names. Well, he had 2 wives. The first was Hannah, and the second was Peninnah. Peninnah had children. Hannah did not. Every year this man went from his hometown up to Shiloh to worship and offer a sacrifice to God of the angel armies. Eli and his 2 sons, Hophni and Phinehas, served as the priests of God there. When Elkanah sacrificed, he passed helpings from the sacrificial meal around to his wife Peninnah and all her children. But he was always gave an especially generous helping to Hannah because he loved her so much and because God had not given her children. But her rival wife taunted her cruelly, rubbing it in and never letting her forget that God had not given her children. This went on year after year. Every time they went to the sanctuary of God, she could expect to be taunted. Hannah was reduced to tears and had no appetite. Her husband Elkanah said, "Oh, Hannah, why are you crying? Why aren't you eating? And why are you so upset? Am I not of more worth to you than 10 sons?" So the first person that we're introduced to is Elkanah, and he's a God-fearing, righteous man. Elkanah marries 2 women. One's name is Hannah, and his second wife was Peninnah. 2 women? I mean, what was he thinking, right? But you know, it's thought that this was tolerated in his situation, even though it did transgress the original marriage institution. It was tolerated because his first wife, Hannah, was barren, and therefore she could not conceive and give him a child to keep on the family name. And so that's why he was allowed to take this second wife. And so every year at the same time, men 20 years and older were required by law to make the trek up to Shiloh, where they would celebrate 3 of the feasts. Women were not required to go there, but they could if they wanted to. And if they did, they were included in these celebrations. And so, you know, these celebrations were supposed to be a time of joyous celebration, of thanksgiving and gratitude, thanking God for all he had done for them in the past. But for Hannah, it was becoming quite painful. because, this is the only time that she actually had to see Penina. It's thought that Elkanah actually had 2 different homes for both of his wives, and he split up his time between going back and forth between each of them. And the only time that Hannah had to see Penina was at these celebrations. And Penina took advantage of the situation. And so she would flaunt her children in front of Hannah and remind her that she was barren, and she would provoke her, and she would even reduce her to tears. Because in those days, it was a reproach for a Jewish woman to be barren. It was a reproach because every Jewish woman had hope that the Messiah would come through her line, and now there was no hope of that. And so these, celebrations had become quite painful for Hannah. I've had women tell me that, Mother's Day can be quite painful for them as well, as it reminds them of their situation, perhaps like Hannah, where they've been barren or they've lost a child. And coming to church seems to, only exaggerate that and remind them of this area of their lives. I mean, think about it for a minute. What if this was your situation? Or just imagine if this was your wife's situation. And when you came to church, everybody else knew about your situation, and everyone turned around and pointed you out and shamed you for not being able to give birth. That's the humiliation. And that's how Hannah felt every year when she would come up to Shiloh for celebrate these feasts. At one time, she used to love coming. She loved her husband. She loved God. She loved being a part of these celebrations. But over the years, it became quite painful as Peninnah's family grew, and she added a child each time. Each year, her family had grown, and she would take advantage of the situation and flaunt her children in front of Hannah. And Hannah was so tormented by this. Hannah's husband, Elkanah, loved Hannah deeply. And so it says that he gave her a double portion of the sacrificial meal. Theologians actually believe that he didn't only give her portion, but he also gave his portion to Hannah to prove to Hannah that her barrenness had no weight and didn't affect his love for her at all. But Hannah was in so much pain that all she could do was cry, and she refused to eat. I asked the Lord about this situation, and why? Why does the Bible not, call Peninnah on the carpet and hold her accountable for her behavior? There's nowhere in Scripture that gives us the impression that the Bible does, right? It only points Hannah out. All Hannah wanted to do was to be a mother and to be a good wife to Elkanah and provide him with a son or with a child to be able to carry on, the family name, the family line. And here comes Peninnah, ridiculing her and mocking her and persecuting her. And if that's not bad enough, and then Elkanah, scolds her for her bad behavior. He doesn't get Hannah. Of course, how could he? Because he's a man. I don't mean any disrespect by saying that. What I mean is that he's not a woman. And so it's impossible for him to understand what Hannah is going through. Proverbs 30 says that there are 4 things that are never satisfied: hell, a raging fire, a parched land, and a barren womb. And nothing can fill that emptiness, right? And so I knew that there had to be an explanation. I knew that the Bible is not unjust, but why is he overlooking Peninnah's, behavior? It's like my oldest son, from time to time, he would come to me and my husband Doug, and he would say, "Why aren't you punishing Jonathan or Steve or Micah or Phil, for whatever it was that he had just informed us that they have just done?" And the fact that we waited on it and didn't punish them in that moment sent a message to Stephen that perhaps his brother was getting away with something. It's not like they were getting away with something. It's just that we had more information about the situation, and that information influenced, when we would act in that situation. And so I believe that something else is going on beneath the surface, that there's a reason why Peninnah is not being called out for her behavior. And when we read this account of this story in King James Version, we discover that there is something going on in verse 8. And it reads one of the words in the Hebrew, and it becomes a game changer. And it says this, it says in the King James Version in verse 8, it says, "Why are you grieving?" Speaking it to Hannah, of course. Or, "Why do you have a sad heart?" You see, in the Hebrew, that word reads as a bad heart. And a bad heart refers to being envious or selfish or begrudging or angry or sullen or resentful. And so it may appear on the outward appearance that she is sad because her countenance is, fallen and she's crying. But underneath, there's this circumstance that's happening in her heart, and it's revealing a bad heart. The sadness is just a symptom of what's really going on in her heart. So we can see then the reason reason why the Bible doesn't call Peninnah out is because the story is not about Peninnah. It's not even about Elkanah. It's not even about having a baby. It's about the struggle, the struggle that Hannah is experiencing and why she's struggling. And we can see that this struggle is real, right? I mean, all those years, it would appear that Hannah was handling her emotions and she was dealing with her situation. But here, at this time of the celebration, it's like she can't take it anymore. And what's really going on in the inside finally comes out through her actions. We all can understand where Hannah's coming from, right? There are times when we have felt like we were dealing with stress or pressure, but we actually weren't dealing with it. All we were doing was suppressing it. And then along comes someone and says something or a situation that becomes a trigger. And then we have this reaction on this person. It's kind of like my chiropractor that says to me from time to time, she goes, Karen, it's not that last thing that brought you into my office. It's the last thing that became that last straw. Or like we say to people sometimes, you're getting on my last nerve, whether they deserve this outburst of reaction or not. They're that person that seemed to be that trigger. And so we can see from our story that it's not about Peninnah. It's not about Elkanah. It's about what's going on inside of Hannah. And she may have looked all those years good on the outside, but in the inside, she's a hot mess. You see, here's the thing. That God is looking for, he understands what's going on in the nation. Remember, we read that even the priesthood had been broken down and were at an all-time low. God knows the depravity that was happening. Eli's sons were Hophni and Phinehas, and they were so wicked, they would do evil things like skim off, the sacrificial fat that belonged to God in the offering. And they would also sleep with temple prostitutes. And so God understood the darkness of the nation. And he put this dream inside of Hannah to have a baby. And this is creating some wrestling, a struggle inside of her, because in the natural, there's no way this is going to happen. Because here's the thing. Not only will that baby be an answer to Hannah's prayers, it'll also be an answer to the nation's prayers. As God understands the darkness, he is working out a plan, and he is planning to raise up a prophet that he can give back to the nation. And so that prophet would lead people's hearts back to God. So it's not about Peninnah. It's not about Elkanah. It's about Hannah. He's got his eye on Hannah. In fact, Peninnah can have all the children that she wants to have because none of her children have been chosen for this situation. It's all about Hannah. But here's the kicker. In order for Hannah to give God back her baby, to become that prophet that would be given to the nation, she's going to have to be able to leave her baby once he's weaned, and it usually happened around 5 or 6 years of age, with the prophet, with the priest in the temple. She would drop her baby off about 6 years old and leave them there for the rest of his life to be mentored by this wicked priesthood. That's a huge ask. I have thought about this as a mother, as a parent, to have put our own children in Christian school to separate them from a secular society that doesn't hold these same values. And the closest that I come to maybe even feeling a little bit about what Hannah is feeling is with our younger son, Micah. Micah came to us one day and told us that God had put this desire inside of him to be a pilot, and so he enlisted in the military. At first, as a mother, I cried at his choice of an occupation and the implications and what that could mean just because of this career choice. But then I had to release him. Because I believe that this was God that put this, in Micah's heart, and that in order for Micah to fulfill the dream that God put in his heart, that I had to release that desire to God. And so here Hannah, she's struggling with all that's going on inside of her, right? She's struggling with the dream that's being placed inside of her, but she's also struggling with the reality that this is never going to happen in real life. And if we were to take a step back and we would look at Hannah's life, we would say that Hannah was the victim here. Right? We would feel sorry for her because she's the one being persecuted. She's the one that we should feel sorry for. But God doesn't see the outward appearance. He looks at the heart, and he sees what's going on in Hannah's heart. And we see in verse 8 that there was some bad stuff that was happening here. And so before God can actually, use her and fulfill the desires of her heart, he has to trust her with his dream, the dream that he put inside of her. And he's just using Peninnah to be able to provoke her as a trigger to bring all that to the surface. And then he uses Elkanah, to scold her and to point it out to her so that Hannah can deal with this situation. Don't you hate that? Don't you just hate that when God uses your spouse or your children or your parents, to bring correction to your life? It's painful, right? It can be humbling. I know, because it still happens to me from time to time. I mean, I think the last time that this happened to me was a couple years ago at a Christmas gathering that we were having with our children. At that time, 3 of our boys were married, and it was becoming more difficult to find a time that suited for both sides of the family around Christmas time, because everybody had their own time slot, and so it was hard to come to a compromise. So during this time, our family got together, and we had decided that Doug and I would host them for brunch on Christmas Day. And in order to be able to be ready at 11 o'clock to receive them, I spent all morning Christmas morning to get everything ready for them. This seemed to be a good solution, because that meant that they had early morning to be able to spend with the other side if they wanted to do that. And they also had Christmas supper. So I think it was the first year that we had this arrangement, and they had all come over, for Christmas brunch. But one of my sons and his wives actually was late, and they were half an hour late. And this created some stress inside of me, because it was my desire that we would all eat together. And the other kids were complaining that they were hungry by now, and so we had to go ahead and eat. Well, by the time my son and his wife got there, I was pretty stressed and disappointed that we didn't have this meal to get together. And when I brought this up to my son, he couldn't understand what the big deal was. I mean, I thought at least he would apologize, but he just said, no, why would you even expect that? They were opening gifts actually at their in-laws at 11 in the morning, and they just felt that it would be rude for them to have to get up and leave, and so he didn't. This really hurt me. And I realized that, as I got that knot in my stomach, that I was going to have to deal with the situation, because if I didn't, it was going to affect our Christmas morning together and probably my relationship with them. And so I went to the bathroom, to clear my head. And I just prayed, and I just took a breath, and I was thinking through the situation, thinking through my expectation. And what I realized was I did have an expectation that I failed to communicate to them. And because I failed to communicate what I was hoping for, it brought this pain into my life. But the Lord showed me that there was something even deeper than that, and that I was struggling with letting go of my sons, because as they were getting married, I was having less and less time with them. And so all of my expectation was around this Christmas brunch that we were going to have, and now there was this disappointment inside of me. Well, I'm so glad that the Lord pointed that out, because I realized that they were not the problem. My heart was the problem. This expectation that I had in my heart was the problem, and their behavior just triggered it and brought it to the surface where I could see it and then deal with it. And so we talked about it as a family, as we do most of the things that come up. And we decided that a good solution would be that moving forward for any other Christmases or any other family get-togethers that we were going to have, is that, we would just celebrate whoever shows up, and we would eat on time with those that show up. And this way that people who come early would not feel like, we're rewarding bad behavior by not eating on time. And this ended up being the right thing for our family. We've had so many celebrations since then, Christmases and birthdays and suppers, and it has not come up again. It has not been an issue. And I think everybody's been late at one time or another, but everybody knows now that if they're late, we're not going to make a big deal about it. We're just going to eat and celebrate who's ever there. And so this is what Hannah was experiencing, right? She has these expectations, but then she has disappointments that creates this tension inside of her, this struggle. But Hannah was not too far gone that she could not hear a rebuke from her husband. And we see this by her actions in the next verse, and it reads like this. In verse 9, it says, so Hannah ate, and then she pulled herself together. She slipped away quietly and entered the sanctuary. And the priest Eli was on duty at the entrance of God's temple in the customary seat. Crushed in soul, Hannah prayed to God and cried inconsolably. Then she made a vow. O God of the angel armies, if you'll take a good, hard look at my pain, if you'll quit neglecting me and go into action for me by giving me a son, I'll give him completely unreservedly to you. I'll set him apart for a life of holy discipline. And so it happened that as she continued in prayer before God, Eli was watching her closely. Hannah was praying in her heart silently. Her lips moved, but no sound was heard. Eli jumped to the conclusion that she was drunk. He approached her and said, "You're drunk. How long do you plan to keep this up? Sober up, woman." Hannah said, "Oh no, sir, please. I'm a woman broken-hearted. I haven't been drinking, not a drop of wine or beer. The only thing I've been pouring out is my heart, pouring it out to God. Don't for a minute think I'm a bad woman. It's because I'm so desperately unhappy and in such pain that I've stayed here so long." Elah answered her, "Go in peace, and may the God of Israel give you what you have asked of him. Think well of me and pray for me," she said, and she went her way. Then she ate heartily, and her face radiant. And after Hannah gets this rebuke from her husband, something happens inside of her. She does something that she should have done a long time ago. She takes her struggle to God. And finally, all those years of suffering in silence, right? The agony of every negative pregnancy test and every time, Penina showed up with another child. Those years of suffering in silence and secret resentments towards God and feeling overlooked and neglected and asking why. Why am I barren? Why is this happening to me? Why are you judging me? Why don't you love me? And it was there in that place of prayer where she moved from struggle to surrender. And it was in that place of surrender where she makes a vow to God. And it's like she's saying to God, okay, you know what? I can't take it anymore. This burden is so heavy for me to carry. I turn it all over to you. I yield to your leadership. If I'm going to have a baby, then only you can intervene and do a miracle inside my body. And God, if you would answer my prayer, I will give them back to you. And if you don't, I'll still serve you. Where have we heard this before? Job. Remember Job? Job reads in the oldest book of the Bible. He too struggled. He struggled while everything was taken from him. The enemy destroyed everything in his life. He took his children and his livestock and his possessions. And even his wife came along and said, "Why don't you just curse God and die already?" Right? And we see chapter after chapter in the book of Job of the questions of why. Why is this happening to me? Have I not been faithful? Have I not taken care of the poor? Have I not showed justice for the poor? And he's asking these questions. But somewhere along the line in his struggle, he comes into that place of sweet surrender where he says, "But not my life. Though you slay me, still I will trust you." Jesus in the Garden of Gethsemane went through a great struggle in his mind. In fact, he was in so much torment in his psyche that it was as if he sweated great drops of blood. But Jesus too came to a place of surrender, and he finishes his prayer by saying to the Father after the questions that he asked, "But Lord, not my will, but your will be done." You see, it's in that place of surrender. It's when we bring the struggle to God and we leave it there that God goes to work on our behalf. And we see this with Job. Job ended up with twice as much as he started out with in life, right? And Jesus, well, God gave him the world as his inheritance. And so Hannah is struggling with what is going on, but she comes to that place and realizes that only God can make her dreams come true. And so she moves from that place of struggle to sweet surrender, and we see how God rewards her because of it in our next verse. So in verse 19 it says, "Up before dawn they worshipped God and returned home to Ramah. Elkanah slept with Hannah his wife, and God began making the necessary arrangements in response to what she had asked. Before the year was out, Hannah had conceived and given birth to a son. And she named him Samuel, explaining, "I have asked God for him." So maybe you're asking that question, why? Why me? Maybe you're feeling neglected or overlooked or even worn out. Perhaps you've even given up on your dream. I don't know your situation, but I do know that God has not forgotten you. He is waiting for us to return to him like Hannah and to bring all of that to him, to bring our struggle to him, to allow him to take it from us, the good, the bad, and the ugly. We're not fooling God by, what's going on in our heart. He sees the heart. We have this face for other people, and it may look that we have it together, but on the inside, sometimes we're that hot mess, right? And God says, "Give it to me." And when we give all that to God, there's this exchange that happens between us. We give God our struggle. We give him those toxic emotions and everything that we have been carrying and feeling. And then he gives us Jesus, and Jesus becomes our personal oasis. He becomes that refreshment that our hearts are longing for. Amen. Well, I just want to thank you for joining us today. Next week we're going to continue on in our Big W5 series, and we're going to ask the question, who's with me? Well, I look forward to connecting with you then next week. And until then, have a great week and God bless.